This all started when somebody sent me a short video clip of a retractable ladder for a loft, and they wanted one for their loft and asked if I could make it. So I thought, why not? So here goes. So first I went and got some measurements from their house. I went ahead and marked those measurements out on the wall because I'm going to build it out in this position right here in my shop. So then I took a long piece of plywood that I used as a straight edge, and I double stick taped a sacrificial piece of plywood to the bottom, and I set it in the fully extended position on the wall, and then I used a straight edge at the floor, and I determined the angle, which turns out to be 16 degrees, and then I made that cut. So then I took that piece over to the wall and test fit it to make sure the angle was accurate, and it was. So then I went and cut a 16-degree angle on both of the side rails of the ladder. And then it was time to make a decision on the width of that side rail, and I had to try to find a compromise between enough strength but yet not so wide that it sticks out a lot from the wall when it's retracted, and I decided on 7 inches. And if anyone is wondering, this is beech. I had some 4/4 rough sawn, and I planed it down just enough to get the saw marks out of it and have clean grain. Most of it turned out to be just a hair under 7/8 of an inch. And then for some reason while I was recording, I felt the need to just pan across this board like it was so beautiful. But what I think I was trying to show is that I had marked out the location for the risers, which is every 12 inches. And now to further complicate things, their floor is 3/8 of an inch out of level, so one of the side rails is 3/8 longer than the other. So then I used a protractor set to 16 degrees, and I marked the center line of each of the treads. I'm going to use the center line as a reference because I'm going to use a router to dado each of the treads into the side rail. And like I said, all the boards turned out to be about 7/8 of an inch, and these are the treads I'll be cutting. The treads will all be cut 21 inches long. I have the fence set to 22 inches with a 1-2-3 block set as a stop. The precision of a 1-2-3 block makes it an excellent choice to use as a stop on your fence. Using this method kind of ensures that you don't get a pinch between the fence and the spinning saw blade, which would give you a violent kickback. After that, I took the 7 boards over and I used a marking gauge to mark center, and then I marked that so I could clearly see it with a pencil. Then I set a depth gauge so that I could get this board exactly centered in its position on that 16-degree angle. Once I had the board lined up exactly where I wanted it, I went ahead and marked it so I had good visual reference. Now because I'm going to be cutting a bunch of these, I'm going to go ahead and build a jig. I'm going to use an adaptation of a method for cutting these statos with a router bit that I showcased in another video. I'll reference that in the description. You may know about this already, but if you don't, you might want to watch that video. So in a nutshell, I'm using the actual tread board itself as a spacer to set the 2 boards on the side to use as fences, and a flush trim bit will follow those and cut a perfect dado. It doesn't matter if you have an exact size router bit, as long as it's narrower than the dado you're trying to cut. You can just use the fences and it'll cut whatever width you're looking for. And now, because this is a stop dado on both ends, I'm setting 2 small stop boards exactly at the marks. That way the flush trim bit will run right up against it and again cut a perfect dado. So now for the setup on the router, it's relatively simple, but it's important that you take a board that's the exact same thickness as the fences you're using. And then you set your router bit up so it's flush with the top of that board. And then for the depth you want to cut, you just add whatever that might be. For me, it's 1/4 of an inch, so I'm going to take a 1/4 inch setup block and raise the router bit, or lower it, I should say, 1/4 of an inch, and that's going to set the depth of cut. Then it's just a matter of pressing the base flat and running the router around inside that groove. Keep it vacuumed out so that the flush trim bearing can follow the outside accurately, but you'll have a perfect dado in the end. And there's not a lot in woodworking that's more satisfying than a nice tight-fitting joint. And to put my money where my mouth is, here's that tread, and see how nicely it fits in this dado. So then I just did that 6 more times. So now when it was time to cut the other rails, it's actually a mirror image, so the jig is backwards. So I'm going to use the same rails on it, or guides I should say, and I'm just going to reverse this jig. And then once I got the jig flipped, I went ahead and just cut the other 7 dados. And before we move on, I wanted to show you how well this method works. I took one of the cutoffs from one of the treads and I gave it the right round over at the router table and stuck it in the joint, and that is the perfect friction fit. So then, using that same router setup, I went ahead and rounded over all the treads. And to keep everything very uniform, I'm giving the rails the same round over. And there's no actual point to this shot, but I just thought it looked neat, so I kept it in the video. And now it's time for the glue up. I dry fitted everything and it did fit nicely, and it's time to put glue in these joints. And because I'm doing this by myself without any help, it's always a little bit stressful. I'm making a conscious effort to look calm and confident on camera, but a big glue up is always stressful. So the next day it was time to pull it out of clamps. I took a lot of effort afterward to make sure that everything was squared up. I was worried about that floor being 3/8 of an inch difference, and that was important that I made sure that that one side rail was longer than the other. So then I checked that to make sure that was accurate. And then, since my floor is level and I'm mocking it up on the wall in my shop, I'm sticking a 3/8 inch shim on the bottom with some double-sided tape. And now with that done, it's time to actually set it up against the wall and climb on it and see if it collapses. It shouldn't. Hey, it actually worked. Then it was time to determine the travel distance. So I pushed the ladder into the full retracted position against the wall and then moved it out to the fully extended position to the tape on the floor. And those are the two tape marks, and that determined my travel distance for the pins that I'll be using at the top. Now the pins I'll be using are just a 1-inch dowel. It's actually slightly under 1 inch, so I'm using a 1-inch Forstner bit, and that'll fit just perfectly. So I drilled the bottom and the top section for that, and then I'm going to go over to the router table and use a 1/4 inch router bit and slowly incrementally raise it up and cut this slot out. And then I used this Temu edge profile round over thingy. It always makes me nervous, but it did give it a nice profile. And then inserted my 3/8 round over back in there and gave everything the same 3/8 round over to keep it very uniform. And now this is my backer board that's going to be mounted to the wall, and it's going to support these brackets and the ladder at the top. I'm gluing this down at the proper spacing for the ladder, and there should be some foreshadowing going on in my mind right now because I haven't quite realized that I can't glue both of these brackets on yet for a reason, but we'll get there. And now on the side rails of the ladder, I've marked out the proper position for the pins, and I'm using a Forstner bit to drill the hole. I'm not going to drill all the way through. I've kind of checked the shoulder, so I only go a little more than 1/2 inch deep into the side rail. And now it's time to set the pin in the hole. Remember I said it's a little under 1 inch, so it's a little loose. I don't want to use wood glue on that. I don't think it would hold well, so I'm opting for epoxy. I've checked the length of the pin to make sure it's the proper height, and I'm going to go ahead and epoxy that in. And now while I'm waiting for that 5-minute epoxy to set up, I'm going to run some screws into the back of this bracket. I'm concerned about the tension that this bracket might have on it, and with end grain to long grain, I'm a little bit concerned of how well it can hold, so I'm just beefing it up with some screws. And then I used that same sketchy Temu profile thing again, and then gave the top a nice 3/8 round over. Then in this scene, you can see that I have clamps on the bracket, and that's because I had to break it back off there. I had epoxied the other pin in, not thinking, and once that epoxy set, you are not getting that back apart. So there would have been no way to put this back together again with the brackets glued on and the pins in, so I had to knock one of the brackets off, sand it down, and that way I can kind of test this thing on the bench. And then as you can see, it bound a little bit, and I kind of had a feeling this was going to happen, that I would need to have more of a profile on the back against that bracket. So I rounded that over some more, and it's now time for another test fit, and this time it actually works, and it does clear without binding. And now with that done, I can actually glue this bracket on and screw it back on with confidence that I hopefully won't have to take it back off again. And now back over at my wall, I pulled 2 screws out of the particle board because I'm OCD and I don't want to drill more holes on my wall. And I mounted a bracket so that I can clamp this up there, and that way I can test the travel and the angle and make sure everything's good so far. And what do you know? It actually seems to work good so far. It holds my weight, it travels out to the right distance. Now it's time to put some wheels on this thing so that it rolls. So then I just cut 2 wheels with a circle cutter on the drill press and gave them a nice round over. And then it was time to locate the drill hole for these wheels. And it took a little time determining this, finding the right area so that the arc worked properly on this, but I was able to determine that. At least I hope. We're going to find out. And then I marked an angle on the front of the tip so that doesn't bind on the floor, and sawed it off with a Japanese pulse saw, and it's time to mount the wheel. Once I got that side done, I did the other side. I did remove the shim off that side because that was going to screw up my whole wheel spacing thing. And then I stuck a 3/8 board under that side to replicate what's going on at their house. Now the elephant in the room I've been ignoring is the geometry of this railing, and it's the thing that's kind of stressed me out this whole project. But I'm going to try to explain what I'm doing here. Is I marked a hole centered in between the 7 inches, so I'm at 3.5 inches front to back. The board, I want it to have full support when it's extended, so it's going to extend all the way front to back when it's perpendicular. The pivot point of that is determined, as the height of that hole is determined by the way that pivots down so it doesn't bind against that upper bracket, if that makes sense. Now with that front railing on, I was able to move the entire thing up so that it's at 90 degrees to the rail, and then set the second bracket centered on the front railing, and that way that is parallel, and that made that second bracket fairly easy to locate. And so far everything's working as intended, so I went ahead and did that on the other side as well. And now I tried to explain this on camera, but the sound quality was terrible, so I'm doing another voiceover so my mouth won't line up with what I'm saying. So I've got the railing locked into its open position at 90 degrees perpendicular to the side rail of the ladder. And now I have a scrap piece of pine, because I'm not totally confident in how this is going to work, cut to the same hole spacing as the other brackets, and I used a brad point bit to mark the location of that hole. But that was a little irrelevant because I know that that should be centered on that 7-inch board at 3.5 inches. But I measured the front railing distance, the hole spacing, and I marked the same distance down on the rail of the ladder, and then I very hesitantly drilled that hole because I was nervous this wasn't going to work out. So then I finally took the board, mounted it in place, and went ahead and released the clamp to lower this down, and all my fears were justified because it didn't quite work out right. This sticks out past the back of the ladder, and you wouldn't be able to recess it all the way against the wall. So I again went back and looked at the original video that was sent to me, and realized that he had made L-shaped brackets in that portion, and now I understood why, so that's what I'm doing. Now with that bracket all glued up and dry, it's ready to test fit it back in that position. I've pre-drilled the holes already, and I'm a little nervous this is going to work, but let's see what happens. And with a big sigh of relief, it actually seems to function. And because I don't want a square corner on this, I left that L bracket piece a little long so that I can give it a round curve to that, and that way with the round over bit will go in there nicely, and everything again will be a nice uniform round over. And then it was over to the bandsaw to trim that nub off and then continue processing this piece. But what I've still been ignoring is the geometry of that pivot. I left that arm that I'm working on a little long on purpose because I'm still uncertain of how this is going to work out. So once we get back over there, you're going to see that when I had the railing extended in its full perpendicular position, the bottom rail, or the bracket I should say, is actually perpendicular to the wall, which works out very nicely. So I went ahead and pulled a couple more screws out of the wall, mounted another bracket so I can continue wrapping my brain around how to progress through this. But the first thing I'm going to address is what's bothering me, that the railing should be a little bit longer and extend below that bracket, so I'm going to make 2 new pieces. So now with those 2 new longer handrails installed, I like that a lot better. And now I have a second bracket mounted into, again, some existing screw holes on my wall. And I'm putting a plate on the back. And this plate is going to facilitate two new brackets that will help the armature attached to. And the reason I'm using an entire board on the back is because we're mounting it to drywall at this client's house, and I don't know where the studs are, so this will facilitate being able to hit good solid lumber. And while I was explaining that, we kept moving through, and I have the brackets mounted onto the back lower rail. I just used some CA glue to temporarily hold them on there while I got some screws into it, because there's going to be quite a bit of force on this, and I want it to be very robust. Then I went back over and mounted that bracket on the wall, and very awkwardly got a measurement between the hole centers, which turns out to be 16.5 inches. Then once I retracted the ladder, I was able to see clearly that the holes did not line up with one another as far as being parallel. So I drew a line at a level mark and determined that there was a 1 13/16 difference between the two holes. And because that was such a nice round number to work with, it was super easy to figure out this part, which is what you see on paper. Thanks, Imperial System. So I very carefully cut that to a very precise length and drilled the holes as accurately as I could. I was still skeptical this was going to work out, but once I put it together, it actually did. It was 16.5 inches on center between the holes, and then when I spun it around, I was 1 3/4 of an inch spacing, so it was a 1/16 of an inch out, which hopefully we can live with. So on the back of this arm, I realized I needed to countersink this hole, but I already had the 1/4 inch hole drilled. And the way to get around this is just to use a sacrificial piece. Your Forstner bit point will walk all over unless you have something to guide it. So once I clamp that down, centered over top of the hole, I can start it. And then once I have it started, remove the bracket and then use the shoulder to drill the hole to the desired depth. Now all that's left is to put the last few bolts in this thing and assemble it and see if it actually works or not. Holy crap, it works. I can't believe it. Okay, now I'm just having fun and reveling at the fact that this thing actually works.